Welcome, everyone. My name is Claire Rosine. I'm Assistant Professor of Slavic Languages and Literatures here at Yale. You're here for the event, Bloody January, Kazakhstan 2022 and the Culture of Protest. I'm very excited to be introducing our four incredible panelists, all incredible in different ways, to give us some context for what has been happening in Kazakhstan since the beginning of January this year, and its connection to broader cultural and political phenomena in the region right now. I'd also like, before we begin, I'd also like to introduce my wonderful student co-organizer, Ilya Karagulin, who is standing by in case we have any urgent interpretation needs as they may arise. So everybody please be aware that we have myself and Ilya prepared to translate any questions from Russian as need be, both for the panelists and for any participants. So the format of the event today is we'll give each panelist about 10 minutes to offer their introductory remarks. They will present, I'll introduce them one by one, and then after all their short presentations are finished, we'll open up for Q&A and also for the panelists to respond to one another. And we'll be starting today with Assel Tutumlu, who is an assistant professor in international relations at Near East University in Northern Cyprus. She received her PhD in global affairs from Rutgers State University of New Jersey, and 2 MA degrees in politics from the New School for Social Research and International Affairs at American University. Her research explores the nature of authoritarian regimes in Central Asia and beyond, particularly looking into the discursive and disciplinary practices in several issue areas, such as nation building, democratization, foreign policy, and development. I'm very excited to hear your insights, Assel. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's actually an honor and a pleasure to address the nature of the talk on culture. And I really appreciate that you actually wanted to pay attention to this particular dimension outside of geopolitics, outside of socioeconomic or social political perspective. I think this is very important. So it's a privilege in that sense for me to address that, because this kind of questions of culture are very much linked to this idea of justice, dignity, power. And I think it's very important for us to unpack this type of complexity as well, by looking and studying the motivation behind it and the nature of the sentiment that brought so many people across the country to the street. Before we move on, obviously the protesters that I'm going to talk about and the nature of culture and the nature of the sentiment that I will be describing belongs to the people who were real peaceful protesters, not the organized groups of bandits that appeared that basically hijacked the desire for change. And we, again, as we all know, there are still many questions about what exactly and who exactly organized them and why exactly they appeared and how to read all of this. It's a big issue. So we're still very much speculating, but the idea is that it's also important to basically give representation and a voice for people who ended up on the street or who were on the street, particularly because they felt that it's their responsibility to have the change and to have something to say about their country. And I want to structure my talk in a kind of to give a preview about the protests that happened before January, in order to situate the January protests in a kind of a better framework, let's say. So we generally, academics tend to think of protests from the perspective of social movements. We think of them from the perspective of democratization. We think of them as colored revolution. And we therefore assume that when people come to the street, they ask for freedom and therefore democracy. And we very much think that in a kind of teleological projection, where we assume that totalitarianism is the worst system to be, it changes towards authoritarianism, or these two systems change eventually towards democracy. And democracy is kind of seen as a natural resolve. And this sets many questions. Obviously, we can see that with the authoritarian wave that started about 10 years ago, all of these things are challenged. And we therefore need to give up, I think, the liberal ethos in general in explaining what happened on the streets of Kazakhstan. And another thing that I want to say is that we also need to basically, I think, reevaluate how we interpret politics. We need to give up the democratic standards, particularly the idea that procedure matters, that elections matter, that that in the authoritarian regimes, rule of law is the way to go. And unfortunately, it doesn't really work like this. And I think the protests actually in Kazakhstan have shown that. Because the locus of power shifts away from the procedural, so to say, understanding of how the state should run, because the state is very much run by the regime, and the regime is responsible for running the state. And this is actually, I mean, if we adopt this type of non-liberal idea, looking for the locus of power, I think it will be very important and fruitful for us to explain not only what happened on the streets of Kazakhstan, but also what can be done and should be done in order to understand the way present authoritarian regimes work. And the reason why I say that we need to give up this kind of democratic prism of interpreting the protests is largely because since 2000s, we have seen many protests in Kazakhstan that were not necessarily liberal in nature. In particular, we have seen that many protests had what we call kind of genuine socio-economic need. And I can call it entitlement protests. And particularly these protests, they violated the law. They knew that they were illegal in many ways. But they still wanted to put that claim into the political sphere. So, for example, we can look at the land protests that happened across the country, where people basically squatted on non-used lands, and they built their houses. So they created the shanty towns that have been there forever, and the government basically closed their eyes during the construction process. And when, with the change of Hakim, suddenly there was a desire to develop that area and, so to say, clear up the territory, there was a very strong backlash against this type of decision and the desire to legalize the property. So obviously, the violence that occurred during those protests was also not pretty, but it aimed to defend that. I mean, even though protesters knew that their desire is illegal, the lands cannot necessarily be or should not necessarily be legalized because they were basically occupied and taken without the legal title, the deed or document. But they nonetheless framed it in a matter of dignity, in a way of a dignity for the people who came from provinces to make a living, especially near big cities. Then there was also the protests of, for example, we can think of the mothers with multiple children. So these women would actually block access to government offices. And they knew that legally, they don't necessarily have the right to ask for free housing. They don't have the right to ask for larger, for example, allocations from the state. They don't have the right to ask for subsidized placement of their children to various state institutions. But nonetheless, they came out. And they came out sabotaging the work of officials without letting them go through, or without letting anyone basically go through into the building. And these types of protests, the type of sabotage was justified in their mind due to the general plight of their condition. So they came out there out of extreme poverty, and because they felt like there is absolutely nothing that can hold them from that can potentially prevent them from real suffering. And then there were also multiple protests of during the COVID times, where we have seen people storming the buildings, basically trying to secure personal support from government officials, especially akimats. These are the local municipalities, where we have also seen how, for example, the farmers in Turkestan region and southern Kazakhstan also suffered due to COVID restrictions. And on one hand, they also knew that, okay, COVID is very serious and strong, and therefore government would have to ensure some kind of limitation, travel restrictions. But because they had all this produce that was grown by taking loans from the bank, they felt that they needed some kind of help. And it was a real desperation for many of them to let this produce reach the markets. So they also blocked the roads. Some of the producers actually let whatever they grown taken for free. But when they protested, suddenly the roads opened. Suddenly, some of the trucks, not all of them, but some of the trucks managed to reach the lockdown. And so what it means is that if we can take a look at this protest, we can see that many of these protests had what we call not necessarily rights-based, or what I call, and together with Diana, we are working on a piece about it, but they weren't necessarily rights-based. In other words, they weren't necessarily calling officials to stick to the law that they themselves created. They knew that the law is not on their side, but they felt entitled for some kind of support and some kind of help. And these entitlement protests, they were growing much more, especially before the 2019, and kind of culminated very much in the present situation. But it's not, I mean, I don't want to say that the rights-based movements were completely absent. Obviously they existed. It's just that the scale of their involvement was limited, and the scale of their support was also limited. They did call, I mean, there are movements that call for political support, for political reform, but they didn't attract as many people across the country as, for example, the Shalket slogan, right, that represented a desire to really change the system, to ensure that the state works for the person, and not for the regime. And I'm sure Diana can talk more about the rights-based movements that have appeared. But the idea here is that the government basically kind of also learned to deal with the entitlement protests. In other words, government which is usually associated with corruption, with the links to financial industrial groups, it's usually depicted as a kind of a wallet of the state for personal use, right? So where officials can use the state wallet for their personal use, and as a result of that, I think a lot of these protests and entitlement protests had the legitimacy because they knew that the state officials are not really playing fair as well, that they are making money. And so these grievances of illegal but legitimate protests appeared and dominated the agenda. And the government, as I said, it learned very well how to deal with them. I mean, they would actually create the most vocal protest. I mean, they would address the most vocal protests, and they would create very personalized and very selective solutions for these people. So they would usually co-opt the leadership, and even though the protests themselves were seen as radical and risky, it was a kind of a risky and radical way of milking the state, we can say, where the groups that would be that would decide to go to protest, they knew that they can potentially be persecuted. But on the other hand, they also knew, because of the previous path dependent, so to say, learning process, they also knew that they may get something out of the state. And when these groups, and if these groups reach the responsible person in the government, due to either through the media or publicity, or basically if the official, a government official himself or herself decides to pay attention to these people, then this plight of individuals can actually be solved relatively quickly. I mean, we have seen how mothers with multiple children almost immediately found sponsors to support their kids, found jobs, apartments were found for people who actually were in need. Different solutions were found, especially when, if you remember, many people lost housing in Aris after the ammunition explosion. And so these protests were also they also resulted in finding housing from the state. Many of these people whose housing was demolished, they immediately found the housing from the state, even though this housing was initially created for people who waited for decades in line to receive something from the state. So in that sense, we can see that the officials will try to basically also use very illegitimate ways to try to deal with illegitimate protests as well. And so all of that, the showcase of success, worked relatively well for the government. It showed that they are indeed the listening state, that they can do something, and it worked for protesters who basically would receive something that they wanted. Again, even though many of them knew that it may be dangerous. In 2019, things began to change, particularly because entitlement became so dominant. But at the same time, people knew that it was time to do something. And I want to just basically spend the last minute talking about the January protests, where many of the people who came out came because they realized that we cannot live like this anymore. And in order to express the mentality that took place on the streets of Almaty, for people who came up from provinces, basically protesting against the real dire condition they were living in, was very much depicted in this movie by Irina Kairatovna, I'm Over 30, where there was a person who turned 30, who was born on Independence Day of 16th of December, and then basically they show his life. And in the movie, basically his dad dies from COVID because his son was one of those people who made money by underselling lung ventilators to the state because of corruption. And so I think so many people watched it over the new year. And I think especially people in provinces and around the provinces, that the slogan Shalket implied, first of all, the desire to clean the state from the regime, to ensure that the allocated money reach the people in need. And the second thing, I think, is to ensure accountability of officials. Does that mean that we still can look at the liberal frame or apply the liberal frame to interpret the protests? We can debate about it, but in many ways, I think Tokayev's attempt and sentiment very carefully kind of depicted the solution, where it was not liberal at all. It was basically that the state is ready to work for the benefit of the poor person. And in that sense, it's still cooptation that is happening. And therefore, I would urge us academics to really think of different other frames of studying the culture of protests. All right, so I'm sorry I went a bit over time, but yeah, I'm ready to answer the questions, I think, later on, right?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Assel. That was very, very useful context. So we'll go on to the other panelists, and then at the end, we'll have our Q&A. We're planning to end at the 90-minute mark. So that would be 11:30 Eastern time. For those of you who are just joining us, welcome to the panel. It's presented by the Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies program at the Macmillan Center and the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures here at Yale, funded by the Kempf Fund and the Slavic Colloquium. If you have any issues hearing, seeing presentations, please communicate with us using the chat. Also, don't feel like you need to hold your questions until the end. You're welcome to type your questions in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them once the Q&A time begins. So if you want to get yourself in the queue, by all means, enter your questions now. Please be aware that the panel is being recorded. So be mindful of that as you raise your questions. And I encourage you to follow us on Twitter, as you can see in the chat. Our next presenter, from academia to art and activism, is the poet Ramil Niyazov-Adyljan, originally from Almaty, but now studying in St. Petersburg at the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Sciences at St. Petersburg State University. He is studying contemporary art, post-colonial studies, queer Sufism, and the steppe. He's a member of the Creole Cultural Center, editor of the website www.polutana.ru. A very accomplished already young poet. In 2019, he was long listed for the Arkady Dragamoshenko Prize for Young Russophone Poets. And in the aftermath of the January events in Kazakhstan, he helped to organize a major online poetry collection on Doxa Journal that also reached quite a lot of people on Instagram. So please join me in welcoming Ramil.
Hello. Do you hear me? Everything's fine? Okay. Good day, good night. Selamat sba. Assalamu alaikum. First, I will write one of my poem as an epigraph. It's from cycle Oyan Hamlet. Oyan Gamlet. It means wake up in Kazakh, Oyan, and there is it's translated by Alex Karsavin and Hila Cohen, and there is an epigraph from Boris Slutsky. Hamlet's got too much hacking and slashing. I far prefer Three Sisters, where everyone simply gets up and leaves, forever departing the game. Wake up, you say, Oyan Kazakh. Look with the pitch of your black eyes. Only smoke and only oil, only cringe and imported cane sugar for a latte in very own metal cup remain here in between wines where early flowed a God-fearing rue. Rue, it's a spirit in Kazakh. O Kazakh, I say in response, there is only one homeland, blood. They have blown up our rue, just like the mosque, the market, and the maternity ward. And those they haven't had time to castrate have taken a son for a son. It's better to barter one's consequence than oil. Our children watch Spider-Man. After all, with the great power comes great responsibility. This wasn't present in the translations of epics told to us. And they loved each other in the ways we never could, instead of disassembling AK-47. My father was taught how to survive in trench with semolina, 15 years expired and worm-ridden, not how to raise a child who went into liberal arts. And even the prophet, may Allah's blessing him and peace be upon him, never dreamed of intercontinental ballistic missiles. The hand of Fatima, drenched in the blood of the wicked, gleams in the sun like gold, but not in the dust that rises from the pressing of buttons. You couldn't just wipe it off with web vibes. So don't wake us, Kazakh. We have gouged out our eyes to make out an enter age simply to sing, an entry age to just be and never to kill. Even the entire folk were to become a shahid. We will able, able to unsee Nagasaki. There is a silence here in the wedding songs of strangers. There was one who burned down to nothing inside a mosque, but I raised the son and I love him. He will grow up mean. He will bury me properly without a headstone, a garden, or any indicators of my existence. This is proper. It's how it should be, but we would never do it that way. It was right in before the COVID pandemic in March of 2020, and I have written some kind of auto-fiction text, and Ilya uh, had have translated it in English, so I will write it. Sorry, you know, it calls there's a little pleasure in being a prophet of the apocalypse in your homeland, and there is an epigraph from Yuri Dombrovsky, the poem that calls "These bitches want to kill me." And that's how I returned to the world with so freakishly colored. I look at you, at your thin woman, at the genius, at the pub, at the tractor, at the taciturn grey evil, at the small good of pity essence, and how they drink, how they sit in sessions, how affairs, and think how unlucky I am. To begin to talk about these events, to remember what is constantly laying on the surface, but is usually hidden by a perde, or a curtain. And to begin to talk about it, about politics and about time, you need to begin with what happened before. You can start from anywhere, from Rurik, even the dinosaurs, but I trust my efforts because I and many of us have nothing more than that. Not in 2011, not in 2015, when I was still in grade school, and I asked my Father, why do we still need elections if we know who will win? My father scolded me and told me not to repeat that in school, so that we will not be mistaken for somebody. Now he says that it served him right what happened with the miner and his brother, the tractor driver. Recently, I was at the grade school I once attended, that former Babylon of mine, and now it seems so small, like relatives dead of cancer, shriveling from illness and death. On the night of January 4th, uh, through the five, I was lying in bed with a girl, and between our attempts to forget the recent funeral and death, she told me the Kazakh cabinet of ministers has gone to shit. I replied, finally, something has happened in this country. Let's do it again. But still, something made me paranoia and concerned. Write to my father, asking him to help my friend's parents meet her. I said to him, it's a dew of blood and glory. Because at the moment she was flying from St. Petersburg to Almaty, she didn't know anything yet. I sense and remember March of 2019, the day when the president left, more strongly and as more important that than the day I lost my virginity or when I first crossed the border. By that time, I had known for a long time that there were a lot of things wrong with this country, but then it was impossible for me to imagine that something could happen, even if it was a lie and a bluff to sense for one evening that you are a citizen of a free country was an incomparable intoxication. Absolutely nothing could compare. And I had thought that I was born under Nazar and that I would die too under Nazar, like one of my friends. Then I understood that we dream too little. As Oksana Shatalova and Georgy Mamedov said, all power to the radical imagination. On the January 5, I woke up with a sore throat, and for a few more hours, there were no signs that it would last longer than a few hours. Social media was already being cut off. The convoys were already underway. But gradually, there emerged the realization that the steppe was burning and that something had to be done. I never went to a protest because I was afraid for myself and my family, because I don't want my father to worry because he has no one but me. When I went out to the picket, the police treated me with more respect than did some of my relatives who were afraid for themselves, but they didn't care about me. After all, Uyghurness is important only when it's beneficial to them. Tribalism of the steppe is overrated. We have been living for a long time under capitalism. We just love to tell fairy tales to children because it's easier to manage them that way. But children grow up incorrectly and begin to believe in fairy tales. After all, they are more than the truth because they say that the dragon can be defeated. After several days of blockade, we did not know for several hours or whether our loved ones were still alive. For some reason, our rich neighbors said such panic was irrational, but our poor neighbors said that they were with us. I ate well. The donkey came out. Please understand them. An Armenian taxi driver told me. After days spent between despair and hope, I began to physically understand not fully, of course, the triggers from the fireworks and the films about veterans, something like Taxi Driver. Despite everything, beside the horror, there was also hope. There were wonderful examples of solidarity, which helped much more than showing the first food you couldn't find at the store near the house into your mouth. I remembered everything I had forgotten, wanted to forget, and had to try to forget. The feeling of homeland, which stirred up in me for the first time in 2019. The thing is strange and modern, but for me, it's more related to living with the earth than to the idea of a nation. For example, from a poem, a soldier kneads dog coquettes in front of the lamps, and the owl is so quiet, calm. I know this near Karachaevsk. Every square meter is so lived in that you want to touch free and farewell. It's Mikhail Sukhotin, poems on the first Chechen War, or the second example. For so many centuries, your soul has been searching for the people. What did your soul has been searching for? The people of Rus. You have got so much earth that you cannot embrace it all. And I rooted my heart to these bare gorges and rocks. Then why again do you come here to die? It's Hasmagomet Hajimuradov song New Year's Night in Grozny. Because we didn't name the mountains, but they named us, because no land is worthy of people being beaten with their muzzle in the asphalt or tortured in prisons. And it doesn't matter who owns it and what language is spoken in it. This is patriotism. But the miracle of awareness works like Russian roulette. One of my acquaintances has become more distinct and sensitive to the fact that the state, no matter what, is us. Contrary to what officials say, and someone else is even more trapped in a cocoon of complacency. They cry for the destroyed city hall, but they don't cry for the people who were shot. They feel sorry for shop windows, but they don't feel sorry for others or for themselves. I still didn't understand why I hate returned to this ordinary life. When it all started, I wrote this. The worst thing is that even after so many deaths, I have nothing more to say. For all the most likely observers of what is happening in Kazakhstan, I will repeat what was said in 2019. Although half of my friends didn't care what I will say, having been personally in Kazakhstan. And I'm not here, you can tell, by almost a miracle. This is all expected. I'm not an opinion leader. I did not participate in anything except a single picket and the cultural struggle. I feel sorry for everyone, but as a queen, it's an irony because it said Skriptani, one of the most popular Russian rappers. We did not become impoverished. We were beggars from the very beginning. We have always been on the tip of the iceberg of the third world. We were close to all those who were usually considered in the Golden Square to be Vox. It's a translation of word Hajj. It's a long story, but Vox is a good translation. And fuck ups. It was not visible in the beautiful bars where I hung out on Nazarbayev Avenue. It was at a flea market in Jarkent, where I grew up, in the stories of friends from the West and the South. Okay, it's okay. In the stories about how the base slaughter workers, shoot workers, rape women imprisoned in prisons, take bribes and take the last from the less pure. And what has taken place is what has passed. And there are just the minute of what was happened in Afghanistan, in Syria, Iran. It's as natural as a hurricane, even if it blows everyone away, including me. Even if I turn out to be a refuge, I know with whom I signed a contract with full consequence in order to have what I have. This is my position, but not the truth, of course. And the last, as the great Uyghur writer Ziya Samadi would say, during this time, the mysterious while of time, the secret of the years, or Taina Gadov in Russian translation, previously hidden even from a careful look, has opened. The most important thing now is to remember that that reality is at times very fragile. Remember this joy that was behind the horror. I'm all. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Our next presenter is Suinbike, who is a creative producer, curator, filmmaker with a focus on activism. She has curated and organized solo shows for several Kazakhstani artists, the Femagora Festival for Gender Equality, the art and cinema sections of that, TEDx Abai Street Women art section, besides being an artist herself and actively participating in numerous exhibitions and projects each year. Suinbike has also made 3 documentaries and numerous video art pieces, worked as an independent video producer. And the latest project of Suinbike is a public program, Matil, dedicated to language justice in the Kazakh language. The major component of which was a VR exhibition she has curated in a partnership with an architect, Aida Isahan Kızı, Yaman Oner, that became a platform for 50 Kazakh and, did I mispronounce? Jaman Oner?
Jaman.
I'm an Uzbek speaker, so I do that to those Kazakh jez. Jaman Oner, that became a platform for 50 Kazakh and international artists. Suinbike has a degree in cinematography from the Kazakh National University of Arts in Astana. Please join me in welcoming her.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today. I even asked my followers on Instagram if they want to share anything from the field, right, from Kazakhstan to the rest of the world. And I have received a little message that I want to read first, if you don't mind, and then go on with a little presentation and maybe a little excursion with my VR show that was already mentioned. And here goes this this little message. It says, the government was quick to estimate alleged huge monetary losses due to governmental buildings and city malls, as well as the list of 16 military and special forces who died. At the same time, they still haven't released lists of 227 civilians killed and thousands of civilians wounded. These numbers were announced by public officials in the early days, and the real number of casualties among civilians still needs to be investigated. Also, since mid-January, there have been many reports that people were taken from homes, tortured, and in some cases died in police departments. For example, Jaslan Anafiaev. For example, on 8th of January 2022, the government forces SOBR, we call them here, Rapid Deployment Task Force, took everyone with firearm wounds from major Almaty hospital, regardless of medical aid needed and without any papers. It's not, we don't know for sure, but mostly it looked like this, without any paper sanctioning in their detainment. Some of them later died in police departments and were found many days later in morgues. Families of casualties now face severe financial difficulties. Civil activists launched financial aid campaigns to help them, but there are already incidents where families are being pressured as relatives of terrorists, and they fear receiving money that could be labeled by the investigators as evidence of terrorist funding from abroad. For example, Gulzia Amrbaeva, the wife of Shaswan Afiaev, and the mother of 6 children. And this kind of examples are numerous, especially when the number of children are above 5, 6. In general, as in the Stalin times, families face substantial risks of being pressured as relatives of terrorists. There are concerns that pressure and violence against activists will increase. Some of the casualties were quickly labeled terrorists and exhumated by police. Yeah, this is the message that I have received, and I wanted to share. Also about what was said in the message. I want to share my screen to show this Instagram account. Is everyone seeing my screen? Yeah. So this Instagram account, Kantar 2022, January 2022, is organized by our art initiative. I suppose I don't know for sure, but I think it's them because it's very carefully done, and it is it presents already a good database of all the victims of the regime, of the repressions that are happening since the first days of January. Yeah, it is mostly the only source of information, and also for these people as well, because it's going directly from these families or from the prisons directly to the people who are organizing this Instagram account. And yeah, so yeah, it's a good database. Well, when we don't have any information, and about this, I'm going to stop this screen sharing for a second. And yeah, there is little text I wrote on my Telegram account when we finally had internet. So I want to read it. At the moment, the internet is completely blocked in all of Kazakhstan for more than 97 hours. It has not been possible to restore information and trade messages. Only last night on January 7, Kaspi Bank partially connected the ability to make payments through a mobile application. Mobile internet was blocked in Almaty on January 4 at 4 p.m. Wi-Fi worked with VPN. On January 5 at 2, Wi-Fi stopped working even with VPN. This connection only worked for 4 hours from 12 to 4 p.m. 4 a.m. on January 6th. And I want to stress this little detail because this is exactly what sometimes getting from the whole image that the official propaganda is trying to show, because mostly they would say that no one had internet, and that's why no one knew anything. But there were journalists, there were independent media who worked as they do professionally, worked during the moments even when internet was coming and going. Also, sometimes we could use internet from different foreign SIM cards, mobile operators. And yeah, it didn't work very well, but sometimes it did. And let me please start with the presentation that we've been presenting with my other, I think all of you see my screen now, right? So we've done this little presentation with Dilda Ramazan. It's my colleague. She is a curator and is based in Paris. We have done this for AFIOT. It's a fellowship program for social, for the art initiatives that work with social and political themes. So this numbers here is just the days of January, and I really want to make this timeline visually to help people from here mostly, and then from all other parts of the world see the most clear image that can be about that was happening as because of the blockade, informational and physical. We weren't able, yes, but still, as I have just said, journalists were working, and many things were documented. Although there were a lot of cases when videos or other material might have been deleted like bodies that were exhumated, because after the internet came back, we had many cases of arrests on the streets of people that would just go like normally they would do, and requests to show the gallery from the phone, and then they would delete if and my friends as well were the victims of this kind of behavior from the police. And yeah, so if some people, as well as they saw other people's in the police department that were with them under the same circumstances. So this kind of case took place. I wanted to start this timeline with this 1st of January, because we went to the Akimat, to this very square Respublika alanı on 1st of January to make a statement about Tal de Col, because it's still being covered with land and used for construction work. And we were trying to make this message visible for people and for the administration, and we never had any any idea that that would be the last time we would see this building in this state, and that would happen on the other day. So here is the map of the protests that started from the beginning, on 4th of January, after Zhanaozen. And I just wanted to say that it was such an important gesture from all of the regions and cities of Kazakhstan to show solidarity with Zhanaozen, because there couldn't be another 2011 that was that happened in Zhanaozen with almost 20 victims, 20 deaths, but Kantar showed us that this number can be much bigger, as we can all see now, with the number of 227, and only officially proclaimed when the real number may be even bigger. So yeah, it's also that kind of map, and I just wanted to repeat these demands of Zhanaozen protesters that have started the unrest. And if anyone, I heard that there is a translator. If anyone can translate what's written, I would be happy if you could.
So activists in Zhanaozen have made 5 demands of the authorities. 1, regime change. 2, to conduct popular elections of every province and city. The people must choose for themselves. 3, reinstating
I don't hear any sound. There's a problem with sound.
Yeah, Clear, you have froze for a second. I'll just take it from here. It's the return of the 1993 Constitution, which was more democratic. Number 4, civic activists should not be repressed or harassed. Number 5, that the person who will become the leader of the system, leader of the government, should not come from the system, not from the pro-regime circles. And in Zhanozhen, there will be a kurultai, basically the meeting of the council of Aksakal, so the elders. At 12 at midday, around 1,200 people gathered on the square, and most of them also demand the return of the internet.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to repeat that the electivity of Akim's mayors was there in the beginning, and sometimes I think this is going from out of the focus, as it was in the beginning when all of this that you can see on the image started, because all of this was I think forced by that there is no political demand, when actually there was. Yeah, and this is some network statistics that I have already mentioned. And yeah, there is a little piece about how internationally the image was искажена, deformed,
Distorted, yeah.
Distorted, yeah, sometimes. Yeah, and Tilda wanted to stress that, yeah, there are different, to each of these images, there are so many different stories that I think already are available. I just wanted to say that about this video, for example, shows the real tradition with the music you can hear. It shows the real tradition of Tutumlu, that is really close to Kazakh music tradition. And the strength of solidarity between Kazakh and Kyrgyz people, yeah, it's available on Klop, this Kyrgyz website. And actually, it's not the end. So it's not the final slide. If I have a little time, do I?
I think we're behind schedule, so maybe let's save it for the Q&A. I want to make sure Diana gets a chance to speak, and then we can come back to you. Does that sound good?
Okay, great.
Thank you so much. So Diana Kudaibergenova is our next panelist. She's graciously decided to go last because there's construction in the background. So if you hear, hopefully the construction has finished by now, but if you hear any noise in the background, it's because of that. So Diana Kudaibergenova is assistant professor in political sociology at the University of Cambridge. Her research focuses on different intersections of power relations through realms of political sociology, dealing with concepts of state, nationalizing regimes, and ideologies. Her books include Rewriting the Nation in Modern Kazakh Literature, which deals with the study of nationalism, modernization, and cultural development in modern Kazakhstan, and Toward Nationalizing Regimes, Conceptualizing Power and Identity in the Post-Soviet Realm, which focuses on the rise of nationalizing regimes in post-Soviet space since 1991. Currently, she is completing her third book manuscript on power, state, and resistance and contemporary art of post-Soviet Eurasia, and she is also working on a new project dealing with state and regime theory. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I also wanted to go last because I think it was so important to hear Suinbike and Ramil is sort of the voices. And I've known Suinbike for a very long time. And I think it's very, very important to bring out this cultural aspect. I'm also really thankful to the center and to Claire and to everybody, to the organizers for organizing this event, after January, although we all live now in post-January, but also it kind of gives us hopefully the perspective of what Suinbike was also providing, kind of like looking into the more or less kind of like a temporal perspective, that it's not something that emerged as an explosion, but something that, it was the process that led to that. And also I'm very grateful because it's one of the few talks where we can actually entirely talk about the culture, and I like the title, sort of like, cultural protest and so on. So I'll try to speak really briefly about some of the conceptual aspects that I'm sort of developing further in these forthcoming publications, as Claire mentioned. And one of them is dedicated, well, both of them are dedicated in many ways to the cultural aspects, but also to the ways of how different movements that emerge both in the political field and in the cultural field, in many ways construct and create the spaces that expand the field of political. And here I start with, I think, a very important movement in Kazakhstan, but also Kazakh Tema, which I kind of view as a field in its own, where different actors and different discourses and positions take place. But here I think that the title of one of the posters that they had when they were protesting on 16th of December 2019, it says "From authoritarianism to the spring." I think it's very much defining of the moment, of what happened since 2019, since the emergence of the Kazakh Spring in March of 2019, when President Nazarbayev kind of resigned and voluntarily resigned, but still remained in power on this specific level in the country. I think it's very, very important that this movement emerged in the cultural sphere and sort of like among the young artists like Suinbike, for example, who we'll talk briefly about in the presentation, but also among the type of urban activists and people who were kind of like, part of different activist movements, and how, which is really, really interesting, the story of how it emerged. Of course, it emerged from the initial protest, but also during the court hearings, when protesters, among them Suinbike, were arrested or detained and were tried due to a specific law that in Kazakhstan basically does not allow unsanctioned rallies. And these people were, in court hearings for psycho-administrative crimes, which obviously are not crimes, but democratic actions. But nevertheless, I think it's very, very important interplay between what I'm, as a political sociologist, quite interested in looking at, not the state-society relations, but regime-society relations. So that's also something that Assel kind of like tackled on in the beginning of her discussion. So now let me just briefly kind of like give the outset of why do I think this kind of like idea between the regime rather than state is so important, because Kazakhstan is, like many other states in this region, an authoritarian state, but also what's really important is that the regime in that particular state tries to occupy the sphere of the political, but also it occupies kind of like the very much paradigms of power relations, and tries to kind of like work out for its own, work out first of all its own system, its own kind of like meaning production of what it represents, and also by doing so it tries to occupy the state itself, which is kind of like an interesting but also complicated idea that I'm trying to unpack through both discursive and institutional accounts of how they're trying to do it. But also what is important is that in these conditions, there is nevertheless resistance, and that resistance unexpectedly, or maybe expectedly, comes from the artistic field, essentially. And that's very, very important because we have a very strong kind of a contemporary art field, which is very independent from the state, provisions from state sponsorship. And these particular artists, as you can see here, I'm also mentioning Sostal Bikol initiative, the ecological initiatives in Astana, where the artists, among them Agrimospan, but also a larger group of artists behind Art Common initiative, for example, are constantly protesting against the very much neoliberal and corrupt sort of ecological crisis led by, both regime institutions, but also very much financial interests of specific groups connected to the regimes, in order to drain the lake, the ecological side, and build another real estate to sell more sort of apartment buildings to the capital dwellers. And this is where the artists, in many different ways, kind of try to kind of stand up with their own bodies, with their own vulnerabilities against this very much state or regime machine. I couldn't find the picture where Asad Ahmedyarov, one of the sort of political artists, was actually standing and sort of pushing against the Kamaz, this particular car here, which really represented this idea of both the resistance, vulnerability, but also the power that artists themselves represent in this particular context, which is again kind of like hard to think about it, that a singular actor like a citizen or artist or group of artists can stand against a huge sort of like, regime power machine, but nevertheless in this particular act and type of activism and type of performance that they are doing, also talking about shamanistic perspective, as you can see here. I think it's a very much figurative and symbolic way of them to claim that particular power. And this is what I'm precisely interested in exploring in some of my forthcoming publications. And the question there for the artists and for the activists that are often sort of amalgamated or connected together in this particular field of resistance is this question of really where is the state and who does the state belong to? Does the state really belong in the power relations to the regime and to the system, as they often call it? Is this really about the particular sort of, regime elites, whether political elites or, the hidden elites that are nevertheless part of the decision making, but not maybe part of specific political institutions? Because as we know, in authoritarian politics, it's not always as straightforward, as Assel also talked about, or does the state really belong to the citizens? So I think it's a very interesting interplay there, not only for the kind of civic engagement, and I agree with Assel, we need to adopt maybe a different type of frame and language for the type of complexities and realities that we're seeing on the ground, is through the eyes also of the activists themselves, through the eyes of these actors who are resisting. That's what I'm really, really trying to do in the pages of these manuscripts, although it's very complex and difficult to do. But the question really is, whose state is it? What activists are basically saying, that it's not the state of the regime, it's the state of the people. And how they identify people is, of course, a very interesting sort of dichotomy and competition that they compete with the regime itself. So I know I'm speaking a little bit complicated, and I'm trying to do it in a really short period of time, but basically what happens is that the means for violence and also means for meaning making that are equally important in sort of constructing the ideas of political in Kazakhstan largely belong to the regime for a variety of different reasons, and I'm happy to answer that in the Q&A. But what happens is that because the meaning making is as strong as the means of violence through different institutions, like for example the police or security forces, as you can see here, but that meaning production and how the regime constructs the idea of the citizen and who are the citizens is actually very, very important for the way that artistic field or activist field is resisting that type of meaning making. I think is a crucial point of understanding this protest culture that really emerged not 2 years ago, not 5 years ago, but actually since the beginning of independence in Kazakhstan, and there, it was developing in different waves. But I argued in different sort of places that the regime has created the specific language of how it identifies the citizens and sort of the population or the people, often by calling them just the ordinary people, depoliticizing them and saying that the people don't really have the access or sort of the capacities and capabilities to engage in state building and to engage in sort of like, governing of their own state, of their own political relations. And by doing so, basically, obviously the institution, by not allowing open and contested elections, but also by not allowing sort of unsanctioned rallies, not killing off or repressing specific other kind of institutions that could have emerged, for example, independent media. That's why a lot of our activism, as you could see from Suinbike's presentation, has to move to sort of digital independent space where they're not yet censored and where they have that space of communication, sort of like alternative visions to be created outside of the purview of the regime itself, and so on. But what's very important, I think, is these three particular aspects that are highly interconnected, and we can see them very clearly in the January events and the way that the regime tried to portray it in this specific language that it's using, is that they constantly talked about marginality, so sort of where the protesters came from, apart from the terrorist groups, and that they're trying to reconstruct now and sort of find them among the peaceful protesters or innocent people and so on. They also tried to create this idea of marginality. These were the poor folk who came from the outskirts, who came from the villages, uneducated. They were sort of like, uncivilized, and they were burning buildings, breaking stuff, stealing things, marauding and so on and so forth. But this idea of marginality is very, very important by segregating and sort of recreating this not only class-based sort of marginality, but also segregating the spaceness of and dividing the social groups where these divisions may not actually be as significant during the protest itself, because as we could see, the agenda of the protest was very much homogeneous, although the protest groups themselves were highly heterogeneous, but nevertheless, the claims were very, very similar. Then also this language of the regime is kind of like desubjectifying not only the protesters, but also people by saying that people in Kazakhstan are not ready for democracy. They're not like, because democracy doesn't look, in their view, in their type of framing, means this like, rioting, which is not like, the good thing for the stability of the country. And the stability is actually one of the biggest frames that is impeding further like, democratization and development. And what it leads to, this marginality and desubjectification, sort of not being ready for particular democracy, is the idea of disempowerment, that essentially you in your own country do not have any possibility or any capacity to change anything, which is, I think, a very important sort of like the way that the regime is using that language. They're trying to kind of create the coherent and homogenizing idea of that many people, unfortunately, from what we can see from some of the responses, do buy into. Sort of like there's nothing that can be changed. One leader comes, another one takes over. So what can we change really? And I think what's very important in this kind of like shift and transformation in that particular language, and the way that the artistic community responded directly to the regime by saying we need to break away from this language, we need to create the alternative view and alternative language to that, really happened with the kind of like a structural change within the regime itself, which is inevitable. And in one of my manuscripts, basically what I'm talking about is that we need to see the activist field in relation to the regime and the structural changes within the regime, but also to see that this sort of relation is not one way, but it's actually mutual, they mutually influence each other. Like, it's a constant relational aspect of that, both the regime influencing the activists, but also activists influencing the regime itself. And I think what's really important here is what happened in March 2019 with this action, You Cannot Run Away from the Truth, during the Almaty Marathon. Almaty Marathon, again, a very elitist, and very kind of like forward-looking event that was organized by the local administration. There's separate story and sort of like who were the local administrators and how they were connected to the regime, but there is a caveat there as well. And it led to the emergence of this group of activists, actually much earlier than that, a month before that, who basically decided that they do have this agency, they do have this subjectivation where they can stand up against the regime and they can say, we want to have the proper elections. We don't want to be just like, to be the society where different rulers and leaders will be appointed, and we want to be able to voice our concerns and claim our subjectivity. And that's where I think, for me, the story is really important, because the movement of Oyan Kazakhstan and also Kazakh Oktyamer, the Kazakh Spring, very importantly formed within the structures and institutions of the regime repressive apparatus. So here you can see the courtroom. This is a very symbolic and sort of legendary photo of Suinbike, who you just heard now, who was, again, on trial for being, an activist and taking participation in that particular event. And she created this fantastic speech that also became an artistic performance of her speaking back to the state, but essentially speaking back to the regime through this institution of repression, both of the courtroom, but also of the prosecutors, of the police, basically the law enforcement sort of like, machinery. And I think it's very, very symbolic, because the activists use that type of language the regime constructed of both repressions and violence and so on, but they use it to talk it back to the regime itself. And actually what, as I said, was really, really crucial and important here is that the protest movement consolidated in the corridors of the courtrooms, which is, again, an essential kind of like a ticking bomb for the regime itself, which I think is super, super crucial. This is 2019, that essentially led to the what we know as Kazakh Spring, Kazakh Oktyamer, which is not so much of a movement. I see it more as a field with different, as I said, different actors and different discourses come into play. Some of them anonymous. There are there were these performative actions with the monuments, like to Viktor Tsoi, for example, in Almaty, that asking the legendary changes from the song of the 1980s. Some of these acts were anonymous. Some of these acts were very much public, but also part of the public art perspective. This is Solia Suleimanova's work, Kazakh Oktyamer from 2019, sort of like the collage in her usual sort of plastic art form. But also these also led to these kind of like, transformative rallies, because in Kazakhstan, rallies, unsanctioned rallies are illegal. So you cannot stand in one place. You cannot even picket alone with posters and so on and so forth. So what Oyan Kazakhstan is a movement that emerged during this courtroom hearings in May and June 2019, April as well. What they created was this idea of Seruyen, so basically the walking rally. If rallies where you stand are not allowed, then we're going to walk, but we're still going to rally for our rights, which I think is very interesting in the way of how, as I said, there is this constant relation between the regime and the protest field, where the field is constantly responding to the regime, but also regime has to respond to the protest field itself. That's where a lot of these concessions on the listening state in the summer of 2019 from Tokayev, from the ideas of kind of like maybe allowing certain rallies but still sanctioning them and so on and so forth. So, there was maybe like not so, these changes were not so significant, but there was a clear statement that the regime was responding to these, slowly but surely responding to some of the claims, even though they were trying to frame them as being minuscule. And obviously, when the protest culture is created in such a way that it creates the frames, and it emerges with the type of language that is resistant, but also alternative to the regime language that used to be so dominant in Kazakhstan. It essentially creates this understanding, both through social media, through other, forms of actual mobilization on the streets. It creates the sense of ability and sensitivity that you are the subject and you are able to change something in your own state. I do not fully ascribe what happened in January, particularly to any of these movements or to the field itself, but it definitely played an important role to demonstrate that there is a possibility of change. And they definitely found a way to navigate the type of language and also discourses and messages that were kind of like dispersed in different sort of social discussions. But again, these were dispersed among different groups, but people would not be able to voice and see them as kind of like a common ground of something. So for example, here's the very famous mural in Almaty dedicated to the former president, Yale. He was, again, he's protected under the specific law, under his name and so on and so forth. And it was actually, saying forever young and so on. But the anonymous group of artists kept on, changing the mural itself. And I think that the crucial point here was that they started this understanding and this campaign to cancel Yale, talking about sort of globalized, or if you want, perspective on cancel culture and so on and so forth, but actually bringing it into a very local political debate of possibilities that opened up and sort of expanded the frames of what is possible in this political field. And essentially what I'm trying to say here, looking into January 2022 from a longer perspective of the protest that emerged and tried to institutionalize itself during the initial sort of 2019 protests, is that we really need to look at it from this perspective of how far this field was expanded and how many different and complex actors took part in it in order to shape and be able to reconstruct or sort of provide the alternative of what is possible, which I think is hugely important for any type of protest, even to give that kind of subjectivity. And if not institutions and sort of frames, then at least the space for the possibility of protest to emerge. So I should stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone. I really appreciated the way that everybody's contributions complemented one another. Assel with your historical theoretical context, Suinbike with your activist experience and artist experience and intense sense of participation and understanding of the issues. Ramil with your incisive poetry and autofiction, and Diana, the way you bring all those components together. So this is a good time, if you've been saving up questions, to put them in the chat or to put them in the Q&A. Or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you to ask if you'd like to ask orally. If there are a couple questions that hopefully will be quick already in the chat for Assel. Assel, have you seen them? Yeah. The one from Walton Burns, one says, have you been, about research methods, have you been working or talking with protesters and government officials to do your research? And also, what suggestions for both the protesters and government officials have you come up with through the course of this research?
Thank you so much for the question. So basically, I actually started from the top down. As a political theorist, I wanted to basically create, to analyze the difference between governance and rule. Basically, we usually assume that governance is related to a kind of a procedure where there is a certain legal perspective that needs to be in place, and basically the role of a government is to manage things kind of in a very Foucauldian manner. And then the rule is usually related to individual rulers who are dictators or belong to some kind of a rule that is absolutely a rule that is usually kind of subjective. And so for me, that's how the idea of rights versus entitlement came up, where the rule is usually related to this idea of entitlement, right? That you are entitled to describe, to decide. Your decision-making power is embedded in an individual rather than the law. And so I started with the top down, and that's why it was a kind of an attempt to interpret the protests by looking, and then I started looking at the quantitative protests, basically quantitative databases like Oxford Society, where they try to interpret the type of protests. It's obviously difficult to rely on quantitative data because a lot of times you have multiple different claims, so you cannot really say that one protest is a certain claim dominates. But indeed, you would see that socioeconomic claims actually make a very large chunk of protests. And then afterwards, I began to look at the literature that was established. So the land protests, for example, a nice book by Balihar Sangera and Elmira Satubaldeva. And then I started to look at the social media protests about the mothers with multiple children. I do have relatives who actually experienced the land grabs and experienced they are mothers with multiple children. So we have been discussing these things. But the nature of my intervention was from the top to the bottom. In terms of the suggestions, how to deal with that, I think it's a rather difficult question, simply because the most important thing is that we need to have, Diana talked about the space, and it brings me to this idea of solidarity movement, where, remember, the totalitarian regime basically fell because there was a space of alternative ideas where people could debate it, people could actually look at something different and look at it from a different perspective. And I think we need the spaces. And the spaces can be created, especially and developed via social media. The spaces can be created by activists, by us academics as well. So the more spaces we have of alternative narratives, and these narratives can be different. They don't have to be related or vested in a certain in certain ideas that may be borrowed from Western theory or the Western literature or the liberal literature. It can be nurtured actually through a conversation. And I think the spaces where this conversation can happen are very important. And then obviously, I mean, when these spaces happen, then how exactly it's going to turn out, I think should be the decision of the people and not necessarily us academics to say where we need to go and what we need to do. So.
Thank you. Suinbike, you wanted to jump in, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the most important thing is investigation, is independent investigation that we need to do. And I think it must be international investigation. And it would be really nice if anyone could help. During these days, I was trying to find any context that I had already that would kind of lead somewhere and to someone who may know someone from, you know, like Bellingcat, and then I found them. They were a little bit busy, but they have nonetheless made this resource package for monitoring the planes, you know, that they used to monitor this jets, private jets that were flying when these events were happening from Kazakhstan to Dubai and different places. So yeah, it would be nice if international independent media journalism could come together in this fight for justice and information transparency, and yeah, that would be really great. And also, I just wanted to say that I have made this crowdfunding campaign for my new mockumentary about the film that Diana has just risen, marginalized, and people that would be called by government as some terrorists and everything, because these were the people that speak Kazakh mostly, and this is I think one of the, or maybe even the most important cause of what happened here in Kazakhstan. Yeah, because we really have this segregation. It's language segregation, and it's between cities and the rest of the Kazakhstan, I can even say, and there is no two-sided movement. There is only movement from this rest of the Kazakhstan to the cities, as a neoliberal agenda would recommend, but not the other sided movement. So this mockumentary that I'm doing in the development stage, and it's a film project, and I really want to make it. I am addressing this very theme, and I really want to show it to Russian-speaking Kazakhs, first of all, to maybe make this connection possible. Thank you.
Thank
And
you. I think that,
yeah.
I think that's also relevant to the photo on the poster. Was a photo that was widely circulated on social media in January. In Kazakh, the banner says, "We are ordinary people, not terrorists."
Yeah,
yeah. Okay, so we are at the end of our time, but a big question has just come into the chat. So I think I'll just read that question and then really give everyone 1 minute to wrap up your comments, because we are already past the end of our time. I wish we could keep talking for hours. So Olga Onuch says, keen to hear the view of all panelists, but especially Diana. As a protest scholar myself, I often struggle with the understanding of the fine line or boundaries between the ideas and phenomena of a culture of protest in a given society and the role of culture broadly defined in protest. Can or should we draw such a distinction? What would be the reasoning for making such a distinction? And how does the presence or absence of such a distinction shape your research and creative work? Thank you for the very interesting presentations. So yeah, hopefully maybe fodder for future conversations, but I'd like to give each of you just, really like 60 seconds to conclude your remarks and maybe bring out what you hope that everyone will take away from our conversation today, so that we can wrap up at 11:35. Let's go in the order we began. Assel, then Ramil, Suinbike, and finishing with Diana.
Olga, thank you so much for the question. In looking at the events of January, I'm just going to say that we genuinely had a culture of protest, solidarity. Solidarity was the name, I think, that was that represented the culture of protests in January, and it went beyond different groups, political ideas, marginalizations, and so on. But what was interesting is that the idea of the role of culture in protest was very much manipulated later on by the regime to basically say that these were the people from the provinces that were marauding the unhealthy, uncultured, people who created all of this. And I think that's where we need to be very careful, basically looking at the protest itself and then ensuring that the narrative about it doesn't get manipulated.
Thank you. Now, Ramil, you're welcome to speak in English or Russian as well.
Yes. Can I be next? Because I have to think about more.
Shall we go to
Sorry.
Suinbike?
In one way, there is a little something that I would even call fear that I normally don't have, but it appeared since there was this whole montage, this edited piece of video was released on the first days of the protest by governmental media. And that was the moment that we realized that they are trying to turn around the table, in this like political kind of way. Yeah, call everyone terrorists eventually. I'm sorry. Yeah, and there are, I guess, some kind of a fear among activists at the moment, and it's absolutely understandable. we have just been at another demonstration that was the last one after, like the first one after the sorry, the big unrest, and it was permitted by the mayor. There were 3 different demonstrations applications asking for the permission at the mayor, and only one was given the permit. So the other one was for Taudekol, and the third one was for the Kantar fort. It says Kırkı. It's like saying bye to all of the victims. To these 2 cases, there was no permit until the saying no to the SAIF. I don't know if it's the right expression, but like actually for eligibility, sorry, выборность.
Electorality of the mayor.
Electorality of mayors. Yeah, that would be the most right version of the name of this demonstration, because not just against the SAIF, but for the electorality of Akim's mayors. And surprisingly, it was given this permit, and everyone was talking about the SAIF mostly, but I don't know if it's actually answering the question, but I just wanted to say that people were saying many things about the SAIF, how they are unsatisfied with this decision, and how they want to elect and choose on their own. And there were not so many people, only 200, 250, because obviously people got even more scared for their lives to even go to such kind of permitted demonstrations. And yeah, I just wanted to say that maybe the SAIF isn't the worst hero character in this story, but the main character is. But thank you. Yeah, I think it's.
Thank you, Suinbike. Ramil, last minute.
Yes. Yesterday, I was sitting in a cafe with Ivan Biketov. It's a poet from Almaty, and he said something like, in December, when people were sitting cafe, they no, they said something like "Shalket, get off Nazarbayev, everything is fucked up, everything is burned." Илья, помогите, пожалуйста. Была форма и было содержание.
There was form and there was content.
Yes. But now, after a moment, after this, I don't have any form, как содержание?
Content.
Yes, any content. I thought when I was in St. Petersburg that when I will came to Kazakhstan, I will understand something, but now I'm in Almaty and I don't understand anything. I don't have a language because when Mutsraev sing some kind like someone burned down to nothing at Moscow, it's in form, it's in content, but these peoples who were shooted for what? For we just sitting here and talks about it, because for me now the most awful, most horror thing that all of this ended so much fast, and now I can't answer this question because for me this perde, this hijab is very, very hard now. So that is all that I can say. I will find the language about it. I hope I will find language about it. But now I'm just waiting, but waiting with some kind of maybe hope, because the world is unbelievable, and our reality is unbelievable, yeah. And third world is very, very near. Yes, maybe it's sorry. All that I know I said now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Diana, you have the last word.
Thank you. I don't like having last words, but I think thank you so much for the great question on it. I think there is a distinction, and I prefer to think of this distinction from the way that my respondents think of it, and artists themselves, because every time I go and ask people, and last time I questioned somebody who was actually a poet, and I said, like, but where is the distinction? And he went into this whole monologue. In the end, he called me, like, that I'm worse than the KGB because I'm asking so many questions. But I think that's what sociologists need to do. We need to be like this bee or buzz, like, that constantly asks the question and tries to make sense of it. But when I started writing about this aspect of art, and it's been going on for quite a long time, I really came into it with the giving the power to the cultural field itself and how they view it. And then, while I was in the midst of it and sort of trying to finalize this really long book that I'm trying to still write, which was actually talking about how post-Soviet art remained, an art field in general remained so, the agenda for them remained so important to be the consciousness of the society, and how that idea changes then in this specific activism. But while I was in the midst of trying to construct my argument between all the Bourdieu's and Foucault's, the Kazakh Spring happened, and it kind of shifted me completely like a hurricane to create the division, because I finally understood really clearly that there is this field of cultural production where every artist is still viewing it from their own position, even what Asat Akhmediyarov is doing, producing some of the most strongest political art and so on, but it has its own logic and meaning to how he does it. And then seeing what Suinbike was doing, even though it was a performance, as she called it, and in the court hearing, but the loudness and the effect it had on society, for me, it was a quite clear distinction between the culture itself that needs to be given that power of its own, and then when the artist is turning to become artist citizen, poet гражданин, we have like, the word like that, but also художник гражданин. And I think there's a very clear distinction that essentially pushed me to separate the two and to write very distinct texts, although like, people will see maybe some correlation between them, but actually writing out the text about the artist or, the art field as a civic kind of engagement, an artist as a citizen was a lot easier than to engage with this very complexity of the cultural field in its own, and having that type of power to stand against the meaning-making machine, whether that's the state, regime, or nation, because I explore all three. And I think we need to give that kind of attitude and that, I wouldn't call it agency, but the power in itself, in a very complex context and understanding of power. We need to really save culture, whatever we define it. And I know it has a number of different, thousands of definitions and connotations, but we need to give it that space and that power. And then we need to separate when artists are pushed on the streets to become the citizens who fight for their rights. It's a very distinct type of culture, protest culture or culture of protest, I think. So I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for your participation and thank you for the questions and engagement from the audience. And thank you also to Christina Andriotis, who has helped facilitate this event through Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies. Thank you to everyone. Have a wonderful day and all the best to all of you.
Thanks again.